town board. Really excited to be here tonight and appreciate your support in getting this process going, and willing to hear what we had to say. I know it's taken us a while, but we're excited, and we think that there's a lot of good material for the community that will serve the community for years to come, and so present it to you for your consideration. So thank you very much. I guess we want to start the PowerPoint that Ashley has. So I'm going to be presenting with co-chair Kirk Ritchie and our consultant planner Nan Stolzenberg. So you're going to hear from all three of us. And oh, people on the side. I don't know. Oh.
That's about as smooth as I'm gonna get it. Yeah. Another part to it.
Okay, good, thank you. So as I said a few weeks ago when we were here to give you a status report, sort of the whole approach that we've taken through this year is about harmonizing the need for housing in Woodstock with protecting the environment and the character of our town. And the comprehensive plan that we've heard about is really the foundational document for the work that we're doing. It sets out the policies that we then took under consideration when we were developing our evaluation and recommendations. And so next slide, please. Next slide, please. Here we go. So this is from the comprehensive plan, the recommendations section, which really, and creating a community for all is how it's entitled. And I think that really says so much about Woodstock and what we've been trying to achieve in the work that's been going on in this town for the last few years. I'm going to read this. Zoning and land use. Zoning is the backbone of efforts to maintain quality and character of the town that Woodstock residents and visitors find so appealing. It is essential that regulations preserve all of the town's assets, especially those environmentally sensitive areas and open space, while accommodating new information and needs. Next slide, please. Housing, again from the comprehensive plan, recommendation, by supporting the creation of a variety of housing options through changes to the zoning law and proactively planning for an expanded mix of housing types in Woodstock, the town will be addressing one of the most important needs identified by the community in the development of this plan. And this really is at the heart of what we've been really focusing on for all these months. And I just want to point out that that is a painting by George Bellows. It's one of my favorites. It's of his home and it's of overlook, and it really says so much about who we are and our history and our artistic bent. Okay, next slide. So continuing on housing, the comprehensive plan says this would attract and support, so this zoning updates and doing this proactive work would attract and support a more diverse population, including young families, seniors, artists, low-income families and individuals, and persons with disabilities. The aim should not just be to institute policies for affordable housing, a term which may have limiting and specific income requirements, but rather foster varied housing that works for different populations and is economically sustainable. We're using the term achievable housing. What is the housing that you can achieve that meets the needs of all those people that we want to support? living in our community. Next slide. So I'm going to turn turn over to Kirk Ritchie, the co-chair with me, who's going to talk about how the comprehensive plan, the underpinning of what we did, inform the task force, who the task force is, how we went about our work, and where we are today.
Thanks. Deborah. And I'll just do this one slide and Deborah's going to pop back up. So yeah, all of the things that we just talked about in terms of the company now leads to what we've done, where we were created by the town board as a task force. We started meeting every other week, beginning July 6th. There were 7 of us. Each of us were members of committees that have to do with housing on the front line: ZBA, Planning Board, a Zoning Revisions Committee, a Housing Committee. Those are the members. So I was co-chair along with Deborah, and so what we did is we first interviewed business owners and leaders and other members of the community about housing and their perspective of the code. And we talked about code directly. We spoke to developers and builders and such. And so we really had interviews conducted, and we then went through a whole process with Maria that she guided us through, where we helped set direction based on the comprehensive plan, based on our understanding of the comprehensive plan and what was important to us, what we gained from our perspectives from the various communities of the housing committee and the other committees and such. And then we constructed a direction that we then gave to Nan, and Nan essentially ended up where we were still meeting every other week, excuse me. And then we've been meeting every week since the end of February, early March, because Nan gave us the version. That version went through a really intense review based on taking Nan's perspective of Woodstock. And that's what the journey has been in these last months, is articulating the various ways in which we translated action, and then how you translate it into code, and from there aligning it with the town of Woodstock and that's what you'll see in the code that we're releasing today. Also we're releasing. So just in the nature of this is that we came to you in January to give you an update. And when we were there, that's what the intention of the Housing Oversight Task Force work is, to make housing more available to people of a range of income levels and backgrounds, while preserving our town's unique character and scale, continuing to protect our treasured natural environment. So we're working on harmonizing housing and the needs for housing and the value we hold so dearly for the preservation and conservation of our town. Well, from there, thanks for listening.
So great. So it's been an incredible journey. We know we're not done, but this is a big moment for us, and we hope for the town board and for the community to begin to listen and learn about what we have been learning about and learning to explore and ultimately recommend to you. We are so fortunate to have Nan Stolzenberg as our planning consultant through this process. I was telling Kirk that I've had a yearning to work with Nan in the 20+ years that I've been involved in environmental and community work, and never came about. And this opportunity came about, and we approached her, and she was willing, and we wrote the grant. So just to tell you a little bit about Nan, she is principal planner and founder of the consulting firm Community Planning and Environmental Associates. They're based in Bern, New York. Nan has been inducted into the AICP College of Fellows. That's through the American Planning Association, and is one of only 53 AICP certified environmental planners in the United States. So she's a land use planner, she's an environmental planner. She's a very, very strong background in both of these things. She has a master's degree in regional planning, MS and BS degrees in wildlife biology, and over 30 years of professional and technical experience in many areas of land use and the environment, with special interest in small town and rural planning, community revitalization, comprehensive planning, and public participation. Nan has developed many planning documents, including regulations, with over 70 upstate New York communities, some of which have won national and state level planning awards. Nan is also principal author of the New York State DEC Seeker Environmental Assessment Workbooks. So she's going to take us through these recommendations, these initiatives, sort of end to end, and Kirk and I are going to pick it up after that. And I can't say that any more than it is my great pleasure to introduce Nan to you and to give her the floor to tell you what we've been up to. We need the next slide.
Okay, well, thank you for that introduction. I really appreciate it. It's embarrassing, but I'm really glad to be here in person because we've done all of our work on Zoom for the last year. So it's great to see everybody like we're real people. I can't start this presentation without an incredible congratulations and thank you to all of those who served on the task force. What an incredible group of people. I've worked with committees all over New York State for about 30 years now. And the dedication these folks have had, meeting every other week and then every week in the hours in between, has just really been truly amazing. And it really shows the care and the love that these folks, and for appointing these folks to this committee. So I'm not just saying that. It's really heartfelt, and you guys have done an absolutely phenomenal job. And as a consultant, a lot of people think, you know, and maybe some consultants do, but they think that, you know, the consultant comes in and says, this is what you should be doing. That is not at all what has happened here in Woodstock. We spent the first 5 or 6 months listening and learning about the community and learning about what the needs are and learning about what everyone's perspective was. And I can attest that this group of people literally went line by line and discussed every single sentence in these recommendations. And it really is astounding because it's easy to write and say, oh, here, you can do this to solve this problem. But to put your own flavor on it and to put your own spin on it, because these have to fit you. Doesn't matter what I think or what anyone outside of the town thinks, it has to fit you. And I really, truly believe that the task force has done a phenomenal job of bringing in their perspective to make this what's right for you. Granted, there's changes and tweaks that will happen, but I just couldn't start until I let everybody know that what a tremendous experience it has been. So with that, I'm going to lead you through some of the major recommendations that are made in the draft that you will see. The draft is made up of 2 parts, the subdivision regulations and the zoning regulations. And the reason that they're both in there is because subdivision and zoning work together. So you can't make changes to one without making sure that the other one is consistent with it. So that's why you see when we started off with zoning, we did have to make some changes to the subdivision so that they work together. But the foundational principles has underpinned everything that we have talked about, meeting after meeting, line after line. We come back to what's important in Woodstock. And that's those foundational principles, as Deborah talked about, from the comprehensive plan that talks about the great pride and love that you all have for the environment and the community and the character that you have in the town. So all of the decisions that the task force made were made with that underpinning of how do we do this and still maintain the things that make Woodstock Woodstock. You guys have done a great job of not being any place USA, which unfortunately many communities have let themselves become any place USA. So this has been designed specifically to make sure that we balance the need for housing and future development with maintaining and preserving the things that you love about the town. So pretty much you'll see as we go through the talk and when you read the regulations, you'll see all sorts of things in there that always go back to environmental protection, siting and design to make sure character is addressed, and traffic and all of the other things that contribute to character are addressed each step of the way. So I also want to convey that the housing issue we have in this country is not just here in Woodstock, it's everywhere, as you know. It's a terrible problem everywhere. The housing toolbox, though, is actually quite large, but the zoning and the regulatory piece of it is just one piece. So that's what the board needs to realize, is that the zoning and the subdivision changes that we're recommending today are one tool in the toolbox. And there's other tools that need to work along with it, like such as the housing trust, such as first-time homebuyer programs, such as funding, such as there's a whole cadre of other tools that can't be ignored when you're trying to solve the housing problem. The things that we have here in the zoning create an opportunity. And just because it's in the zoning doesn't mean it's going to happen. It creates the opportunity for it to happen. So what we're recommending today is not the magic bullet. It's not the poof, we're going to solve the housing issue by adopting these changes, but it will create the opportunity for more to happen in the way that you need it to happen. It will hopefully create a process so that there's more certainty in the planning process, so people will want to do these kinds of developments and these kinds of activities here in town. So the toolbox that we have included in zoning, as I mentioned, includes both subdivision and zoning changes. It includes new tools and new types of housing opportunities that will become available to expand housing opportunities. And as I mentioned, it will increase, we've added in some things that we hope will increase the predictability and the clarity and the ease of understanding the zoning and knowing that it will, what we hope to have in zoning is always high expectations. You're a community that have high expectations, but if you state what those expectations are, at the end, the applicant gets a yes. That's what we're trying to achieve. And we're trying to create that kind of situation. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, our foundational principles that underpinned all of this was everything we did must offer environmental protection and protection of community character, that they need to make sure that the planning process emphasizes environmentally sensitive areas, that it must offer more opportunities for housing, and opportunities for landowners to do something with their land. So it's a balance. Planning is always a big balance in that way. And so we're trying to balance, I always call it like have our cake and eat it too. We want to have responsible development that fits in your community, that meets all of these other sometimes competing goals. We want to allow for creativity. You'll see in the draft that there are a lot more shalls in the language. This, you shall have screening, or you shall not be placed in a certain location. But within that context, we certainly don't want to take away people's ability to have creative thoughts about how to use their land, how to develop something, what the building should look like. So again, we have that balance between shall and creativity. And as I said, the other foundational underpinning was we want to make sure that everything we have in the zoning code is clear so that when someone reads it, you'll understand what it means without having to go to an attorney. So that's what we're trying to aim for. Okay, next slide, please. So as I said, even though the overall housing toolbox is big, the zoning and the regulatory toolbox is also big. And we have purposefully included a lot of tools in this zoning law. You will see that it's not just one thing. We haven't hung our hat on saying, oh, well, we're going to allow X. We've tried to accommodate a whole comprehensive set of methods to get at different aspects of planning, because housing is not unidimensional. We don't all live in single family houses on big lots. And so you have lots of different kinds of housing already in Woodstock that we need to build on. So you can see on here that there's a list of the major things that you will see addressed in the zoning. More opportunities for accessory dwelling units, to have major developments, should they ever come to town, be developed with a conservation theme. And that's called a conservation subdivision. And I'll get into some of these in a little bit more detail. Offering more of a variety of housing types that are allowed under the zoning law, including 3 and 4 unit smaller buildings, use of tiny houses, the ability for clustered lot subdivisions, which we'll get into again. We'll go through all of these. Co-housing, continuing care retirement, community senior housing. We have tried to include all of these techniques to make them available as the need arises. We have added in what's called a density bonus section, which incentivizes someone to provide achievable housing for others. And so it's kind of like you give the town something that it wants, i.e. more affordable housing. And in return, we as a town give you something in terms of extra density. So that's a density bonus that allows someone to build a little bit more than what the zoning says for that district by giving the kind of a give and take there. So we've been trying to incentivize the provision of different kinds of housing. You'll see that there's a lot, your zoning now has always allowed multifamily dwellings. So that's not anything new, but what is new is that we have articulated the performance expectations for those multifamily houses. So that's not just this big what if, what will come, how will it act, how will it function on this parcel. We tried to lay that out. So again, it's predictable so that an applicant or landowner who might want to have some sort of multifamily dwelling can read the expectations and say, oh, I can design it that way, and hopefully move through the process. So we've called that more controlled multifamily development. And we've included what's called a floating residential district, which I will get into in a little bit more detail. So this is kind of our zoning toolbox that you'll see shown in the, in the regulations. Okay, next slide, please. So let's talk about, I picked some of these to go over in a little bit more detail. Accessory dwelling units. Your zoning has had them in the zoning. They were called apartments. We've renamed them to what kind of the standard is now, accessory dwelling units. It's basically a secondary dwelling unit on a property associated with a single family residence. So not with a multifamily dwelling or not with some big development, but someone owns a house or a property and they have they want to have an accessory dwelling. So these, we have added in 2 kinds that someone is eligible to have. One would be an attached accessory dwelling, that means you build on your house and you add a little dwelling unit on the back of your house. Or the second way is what's called a detached accessory dwelling unit. And that is, as you can see in these pictures, you turn a garage into an accessory dwelling, or you have a little cabin type structure that can be an accessory dwelling. The Housing Task Force was very committed to accessory dwelling units as a really important option to have in Woodstock, to give both landowners opportunities and other people who need the housing opportunity. So the section about accessory dwelling units allows for 2 accessory dwelling units on the property. Of course, again, going back to our environmental principles, you have to have the same kind of setbacks, you have to have water and sewer, you have to have all of those things that go along. We have some development standards for the detached accessory dwelling units, so to make sure they're not built on wetlands, they're not built on steep slopes. And we've taken into consideration that they too need to be sited in a way that protects the environment and the character. The other thing about the accessory dwelling units is that the intent of these is to be used for long-term rentals that would be achievable for people in the community and not for short-term rental. So you will see that the recommendations are, thank you, that the recommendations are that accessory, that only one, it goes back to what you currently have, but only one property or one short-term rental per parcel would be allowed. So that doesn't exclude it from being in an accessory dwelling, but if you had 2 accessory dwellings, you couldn't have 2 that were built solely for short-term rental purposes, because the goal is to have housing for people who need housing. Okay, next slide, please. And did I forget anything about accessory dwelling units? Okay. Okay. The next technique that we've included is one that is one of my favorites. It's called a conservation subdivision. These are techniques that is a modern version of what you currently have in your zoning, which is to allow clustering. Clustering is kind of the old term that we used to use for that. Now, pretty much we use the word conservation subdivision because it conveys that the underpinning of that development is to conserve the important components and elements of that parcel. So the conservation subdivision is a technique that's applied to major subdivisions. So that would be 5 lots and more. You don't have, I know you don't have a lot of them here in Woodstock. Maybe you never will, who knows? But it will be a technique that will be available should that happen. And the way it's written is that major subdivisions, 5 subdivisions or more, would be required to be developed as a conservation subdivision. So you can see on the screen the difference between, on the left is a conservation subdivision, and on the right is what we call a conventional subdivision. And right now, the way things work is, let's say someone has a lot and they're eligible for 10 houses. They pretty much, no offense, I hope there's no surveyors in the room, but they pretty much take the 100 acres or whatever it is and divide it equally into 10 lots, taking into consideration where the road and, you know, the infrastructure has to go. And the environmental and the character and the cool things about that parcel are split up and lost to, you can see they're just kind of spread out over the landscape. The conservation subdivision turns that completely around, where we start with understanding what are the environmental elements that are important on that parcel and designing the house sites. Because what matters to us is not where the lines on the map are. What matters is where the buildings go and how the buildings affect the landscape. So the conservation subdivision starts with analyzing what's on the land. Are there wetlands? Are there steep slopes? Are there habitats that are important to look for? And we map and identify where those are. And then we place the house sites so that each new house has either physical access to preserved open space that goes along with the conservation subdivision. So every conservation subdivision starts with the environmental features and has a 50% requirement for 50% of the lot to stay as preserved open space. And that 50% is determined during the planning process. So the house sites are located to have visual or physical access to that open space. And the last step of a conservation subdivision is then the lot lines are drawn in, because those are really the least important. When you're looking at development from a conservation point of view, the lines on the map really are the least important part. One of the things that is a little difficult for some folks to get is that conservation subdivision is what we call density neutral. Even though you're saving 50% of the parcel, it doesn't mean you lose 50% of the eligible houses that you have. The zoning district that you're in determines how many houses you get. And you get the same number of lots if you count those up, there's the same number of lots in both of those pictures. If they're just situated differently on the landscape. So the conservation subdivision is a design and layout technique to get you better development. The reason why we've added this in for housing is because the flexibility that goes along with the conservation subdivision allows for smaller lots to be developed and more creativity in hopes of limiting the amount of road and limiting amount of the infrastructure that has to be built that could be translated into more affordable lots to sell. So there's definitely an environmental component, but there's certainly a housing component as well. So in these, I know these are just quick little snippets of these techniques, and when we have question and answers later on, I'm sure we'll have more time to get into these in more detail. Okay, next slide, please. So some of the other expanded housing opportunities that we're going to talk a little bit about, as I mentioned before, you'll see all of these as potential options for potential development in the zoning code. So I think I'm just going to skip through this slide fairly quickly and get into some of these other things. All right, let's go to the next slide, please. So triplex and quadplex, fancy name. It's really kind of going back to the kind of development we used to have, a long time ago, before single family dwellings took over everything. So these are, the zoning allows for these smaller kind of in between a single family dwelling and a multiple family dwelling. And so we created this new category of housing called triplex or quadplex. So there would be one building that would have either 3 units in it or 4 units in it. So it could be 2 on the floor, 2 on the ground floor, and 2 upstairs. These are designed to be, and specifically in the regulations, you will see that they are designed so they must be designed so that they're single family like. So these are really just they would function like a large single family. It would be on the same footprint that a single family house could be, but they have multiple units in them. And so the thinking is that these are less intensive. These are more easily cited like a single family would be, which you don't have really any review for, through the planning board now. And we created a new review process. Again, this is kind of a housing type that bridges, it's in between typical single family and multiple family. And so the MSRP that you see here stands for Modified Site Plan Review, the MSRP. So we have a new category of 3 and 4-plex with a new review process. And a modified site plan review is just what it says. It takes the full-fledged site plan review that we currently have in the zoning and targets it so that it's not looking at the commercial ingress and egress and signs and all of the things that normal site plan gets at. It's targeted with a more focused review process that hopefully will be predictable. In the hopes that this kind of housing could be that bridge for like that missing, you've heard the term missing middle housing. That's what we're trying to get at with allowing for these 3 and 4-plex buildings in the with the notion that they pretty much function like a single family home would on a piece of land. So we have the 3 and 4-plex in there with the modified site plan review. Okay, next slide, please. So at the beginning, I talked about the controlled multifamily buildings. A couple things I know everybody, not just here, but everywhere, you say multifamily and people are, we don't want it. We don't know what they are. They're going to be too big. They're going to be too something. So we recognize that. So you'll see that the section on multifamily housing has quite a few shalls in there. It shall be this, it shall be that. And that is because we're recognizing that multifamily dwellings are a big change for our community. And like, the issues that you had for years trying to get the RUPCO Woodstock Commons in, we want to learn from that and try and find out how can we make sure that it doesn't take 7 years. And I'm not criticizing it because it happens everywhere, but what can we do to get you the kind of development that will fit here, but not have to go through that kind of process. So a couple things that we have among many siting and design standards for multifamily dwelling, including screening, very specific screening that we had lots of conversation about what kind of screening. We need to require screening because we want to make sure it's compatible with the neighbors. But we're not letting these big, huge buildings come in. We're limiting the multifamily dwelling structures to be no more than 8 units. So you might have a larger development, but the buildings themselves are going to be scaled so that they are consistent with the scale and intensity of the general community. We also have, so that, because it's the uncertainty that is what gets folks in the community upset. It gets what developers or landowners get upset with, the uncertainty. So we've tried to box in those parameters. So for multifamily dwellings, you'll see in the use or in the area and dimensions table that if someone is proposing less than 40 units, so that would be several 8-unit buildings. If someone is planning that, it would be permitted through the special use permit and site plan review process. But we've set up, and I'm going to talk about that, I think, in the next slide, a couple slides, that if someone wanted to have more than 40 units, that's getting to be a little intense. That's getting to be where people will start to say, is that going to work? How is that going to affect me? How is that going to affect our community? So over the 40 units, we have required that then that flips into this floating residential district that I'll talk about in a minute, with a maximum of 60 units. So we put some boundaries on these things in what I think the task force feels, at least, that they're reasonable, kind of using the Woodstock Commons as the scale. Then in terms of the number of units, you can picture what that looks like and how that works. And so you know that you're not going to have one of these, 1,000-unit things come into the community. So we have put bounds on it. But again, it tries to balance the housing needs with all of the other needs in the community. Did I miss anything on multifamily? Okay, let's go to the next slide. I'm gonna let Deborah just point out these two slides.
Yeah.
Sorry, pictures on the slide.
So these are pictures. A lot of the pictures you'll see, these are actual developments that are happening around the country. In fact, that 3 and 4-plex, that big farmhouse, it's an actual farmhouse in Massachusetts with 4 dwelling units in it. So it's really interesting. Here, and the previous slide, right, was Woodstock Meadows, which, as you know, is right down the road. And on the right, that's a multi-family, I think semi-attached, not quite sure, but it's a co-housing development for seniors, and it's really quite lovely, and it has some more mature plants and things like that. And the one on the left is another multi-family, lower scale. These are both kind of lower scale multi-unit developments.
Yeah, and so I think the important thing is, from an aesthetic point of view, but also from a functional point of view, these kinds of developments don't usually just organically happen. These have to be planned for. And how do you plan for them? You have regulations in your zoning that says you need to have this kind of landscaping. You need to have them clustered in a certain area, or they need to be single family in style. We have a section in there that talks about that multifamily buildings have to have, there's a series of design features that they need to choose. They can have a kind of a palette of design features that need to be included. So again, we're trying to balance providing the opportunity with siting and design standards that will make it acceptable to fit into Woodstock. Okay, let's go on to the next slide, please. So you'll see in the recommendations that we've also included the use of clustered cottages, which in the zoning is called clustered lot development, because cottages is, everyone has a different figure in their head about what a cottage is. Co-housing, continuing care, and tiny houses, they're all defined. You'll see in the zoning that there's a much expanded definition section. So we tried to define all of the words that we're using here so that everyone understands what it is we mean. But the clustered cottages, so think of a conservation subdivision, which we talked about a minute ago, where each house is on its own lot. A clustered cottage development is really one parcel that has multiple dwellings on it, but they're not subdivided into their own lot. So we wanted to make sure that we provided an opportunity for that kind of development to occur. So there's a whole section in the whole subsection in the housing section that describes what are the expectations for clustered lot developments. How can they be developed? How much open space should there be? What kinds of environmental features should be evaluated and protected? So each one of these has that same kind of underpinning. Tiny houses are something that has been added in and defined. Tiny houses are now in the New York State Building Code. So we have adopted the New York State Building Code definition of tiny house. And I should have mentioned earlier that the accessory dwelling units, the multifamily dwelling units, and the tiny houses all have size parameters from 300 square feet to 1,500 square feet. So again, we are adding in a variety of sizes that those units could be, but putting some boundaries on there so they are, again, in that controlled kind of way. So these are just some pictures of different the clustered lot development section takes the same principles as the conservation subdivision in terms of looking at the environmental features and the character of the parcel and designing around those, so that the structures are all placed clustered together. The continuing care retirement community, there's a lot of rules in New York State for how those should be built, and they're actually highly regulated in New York State. So we reference that, we allow them under certain circumstances and under certain review processes. So those are all, you'll find them all in there. Okay, next slide, please. So you heard me talk about this floating residential district. You currently have in your zoning a planned, what's called a planned residential district. And in the planning world, or at least some planners call a planned residential, a planned unit development is basically legalized spot zoning. It's basically, you have a big parcel of land and someone comes in with an idea that doesn't fit into your normal zoning. And they say, hey, I'd like to do this. And basically the planned unit development is a process that's negotiation with the town board. And all the rest of the zoning gets negotiated out or thrown away. And the town board has complete control over what happens in a planned unit development. They can be wonderful when it works. But I've seen a lot of places where the planned unit development it doesn't work. And good projects are denied and bad projects go through for a variety of reasons. So we wanted to keep the theory of there are some things out there that might be bigger that we can't guess right now what they might be. But again, we want to make sure that all of these things come in and fit into the performance expectations of Woodstock. So the floating residential district is a zoning district. It's got uses that are allowed. It's got densities that are allowed. It requires provision of achievable, I think it was 60% of the houses in a floating residential district needs to be in that income achievable range. So it's got all of the things you would see in a regular zoning district, except it's not mapped. That's why it's called floating. And so it's in existence until the time that someone says, I'd like to apply all these development standards to this parcel of land. And then it's a two-step process. It still has to have approval by the town board in order to move forward. But you now, instead of having the world, now you have really concentrating on where is that the location that that district is suitable to be in. So the floating residential district outlines the criteria that would need to be met in order to approve a floating residential district. So we would have to look at environmental features, traffic, design, infrastructure, all of those things go into the process. And the two-part is, so it's the town board has ultimate decision about whether to map that district in a certain location, along with planning board input. So that's baked right into the process that the planning board has to evaluate it at the same time. So ultimately you make the decision, but it's a much more predictable for both the community and the developer method of addressing something that may be large. So what we have done is we have, the task force decided that 40 unit cutoff seemed reasonable, that when you get above 40 units, that's getting to be maybe something that needs a higher degree of looking at. And so any development, any multifamily development, any other kind of development that's 40 units or higher would be automatically need to be approved as a floating residential district. And then it would get mapped if you approved it at that time. Again, with the same environmental site and design features that kind of underpin everything. Okay, next slide, please.
Questions right now, Kevin. We'll go through the whole process, okay?
So the density bonus, I mentioned that in the beginning, this is an incentive program. And it basically is totally oriented to those achievable housing units. And it's basically, if you, landowner or developer, say, I'm going to devote a percentage, and I'd have to look up exactly what percentage it was, a percentage of the dwelling units that I would like to build, I'm going to deed restrict those as affordable, achievable dwelling units for 50 years, which is a common way of doing it. Then we're going to give you a bonus. And if you were normally eligible to build 10 houses, maybe you'll be able to build 15 houses or 12 or whatever the math would work out to be. The density bonus is established and you're authorized to do that by New York State town law. And you can look at that, that town law. They're very clear that when a density bonus is given, it's not just this willy-nilly, sure, we're going to give you a density bonus. You have to make sure that the number of dwellings that you're going to put on that parcel actually work there. There's got to be enough room. Can't have traffic impacts. It can't have water and sewer impacts. So there's criteria that would have to be met and a process that's laid out in state law to give a density bonus. So we have incorporated those into this. You know, the density bonuses are usually for large developments. Your everyday kind of development in Woodstock that we currently have right now probably wouldn't ever take advantage of the density bonus. But again, it's there to create an opportunity and to try and incentivize people saying, hey, you know, it would be worth it economically for me to provide these achievable housing units in return for a little bit extra density. And the other thing is that I want to mention is that the recommendations clearly state that the units that would be deed restricted for affordable are treated no differently than any other unit. So you can't have like these $1 million homes and then this tiny little shack that you call affordable. They're equal units. So let's go on to the next slide. So we have added in, because the task force, at least in my opinion, was acutely aware of the important role that the environment plays in what you all value about Woodstock. So there's various tools that we have added into the zoning to try and get you this balance. We want to have development, but we don't want it to overrun the place. So one of those that I think is a really important one that I recommend in communities that are really wanting to get at quality development that really respects the environment is a tool called net acreage. And net acreage is a method that we use to make sure that the number of houses on any given parcel actually work for that parcel. Because a lot of times, let's go back to our 100-acre parcel. It's very rare indeed to have 100 acres, flat, perfect land with nothing that is sensitive or that we worry about. No, you usually have a steep slope, or you have a wetland, or you have a stream, or you have a rocky outcrop, or something that limits the development. So the actual capacity of that parcel is not the total acreage. So net acreage is what we have added in for all development to try and get at this environmental balance by saying, we want you to calculate how many home sites you're eligible for by the actual developable spots on the land. So here's an example of a parcel. I guess you can't really see the line too well along the field. An example of, we have 45 acres. The total parcel is 45 acres. But of those 45 acres, 8 of them are a wetland, can't build in a wetland, shouldn't build in a wetland. But there are no other environmental features, it's just a big open field except for that wetland. So the net acreage is actually 37 acres. So so if you were in the R, and I'm not good at math, if you were in the R8 district, it would be 37 divided by 8. 4, thank you. So the net acreage gives you a density of homes that actually fit the parcel better than simply dividing it up into however many you can fit in there. So that's why this toolbox, everyone, all of these techniques kind of work with all of the others. So we use net acreage to help us get our capacity to be a realistic capacity. We use design and siting standards to make sure they're designed and sited on that parcel in a character and environmentally friendly way. And we use something else that is in here that I think is very helpful. And that's using what's called an average lot size. So right now, let's take your R5 district. And so let's say you get 5 lots and you split it into 5 5-acre lots. Well, that forces someone to buy 5 acres of land. And that can be very expensive indeed. It might not be good for character or the environment either. And I can tell you that the history of using minimum lot sizes comes from early attempts at reducing density. That's where they came from. They're back in the 60s and 70s when all of minimum lot sizes started to get laws. It was to try and space people out and control how many there are. But it's a very imprecise and inartful way of doing that. The average lot size allows you to take, let's say you are eligible for those same 5 lots, but you average the lot size of those 5 lots. You can have some that are very small, some that are very big. It gives the landowner a ton of flexibility to develop with the land, and maybe to have 2 or 3 very affordable small lots and another big estate lot. So just by simply allowing you to average the lot size to equal the density that you're allowed is a huge step forward to giving people the opportunity to create smaller lots and have them more affordable. Okay, next slide. Okay. So yeah, we talked a lot about design and siting development standards. One thing that you'll see in the recommendations, you have some terrific tools already in place to get at design and siting. You have the community design manual that Ulster County did, which is packed full of information and great ideas. You have, and I think there's a slide coming up later on, you have the design manual that was done for Woodstock. That is terrific. It's got tons of great stuff in there. And so the zoning recommendations actually memorialize the tools that you have. You have tons of maps, you have the natural resource inventory, you have all the things that you need to make good land use decisions. And so we've tried to bring those out in the zoning so that you can use them. Okay, next slide, please. As I mentioned before, our goal is to try and tell you what the rules are so you get the yes at the end. And so how have we done that? First of all, we have updated some of the planning board procedures. So the procedure is very clear. We brought in, the planning board is actually authorized to be formed by New York state law. And we have brought in the specific timeframes and the specific steps that are laid out in that state law for the planning board to function under. So we've tried to clarify the process. We've updated the purpose statements so that housing is an equally important goal of the zoning as any of the other things are. And I can't emphasize enough the important role that the purposes play in a zoning law. When you get sued, the first thing the court will do is look at why are you regulating it this way? So your purpose statements are your principles as to why you're regulating someone's land. So housing was added in very strongly, I think, through great language that the housing task or the housing committee had developed early on. We've added all of these things that I've talked about tonight are in one chapter, the housing chapter. So they're all in one place. So if you're interested in any kind of housing things, you can go to that one chapter and read them all in one place rather than all over spread out throughout the whole zoning law. I mentioned that we've added in a lot of definitions. Can't ever have enough definitions. I mean, I don't know how many pages of definitions there are, but there's a lot of them. So hopefully we've caught them all. And then again, you will see that the draft that we have is redlined, so you can see everything we suggesting deleted has a cross out. Everything that we're suggesting gets added has an underline. And as we went through, we found some little things here and there that could be tweaked just for clarity, not to change policy or direction, but just say, what does this sentence really mean? Can we say it in a way that's simpler? So there, you'll see that kind of scattered throughout. Okay, and then the last slide that I'm going to go over, next slide, please. So this was a lot of nuts and bolts. And maybe a lot of new terms that you haven't heard before, and I'm sure you're going to have lots of questions about how they work. But I want to leave you with the task force was very focused on making sure this is beneficial for housing and beneficial for the environment. So we feel that each one of these, and I think there's going to be a handout for the town board at the end that kind of details all of these benefits. On this housing side, we feel that these recommended regulatory changes increase opportunities for achievable housing in terms of locations, types, and styles. We feel that there's a benefit by offering people incentives to provide something that you need and value in the town. We feel that the flexibility that we built in terms of the conservation subdivision and the average lot size, for example, are things that make it make landowners, it's a lot more easy to plan around those features. And so the flexibility in and of itself is a benefit to make housing more affordable because the developments will be easier to develop and to design. And as I said, the predictability and the clarity of the zoning is really important. Just as an aside, lots of places I go, small rural communities, very shy about any kind of zoning. And they look at a 200-page zoning law and they freak out like, oh my goodness, are you kidding me? 200 pages of regulation. But what I can say though, is that a 20-page zoning law is so vague that no one knows what it means. And you end up treating different people different way, different developments differently. There's nothing good about a vague zoning law. So I would hope that we don't look at the number of pages, but we look at that we've added clarity. On the environmental side, as we've talked about, we've clearly laid out the environmental and the community character performance expectations through siting and design standards. We've kind of balanced the development capacity that will match the land. And we have created opportunities for larger developments that may come in the future, maybe not, but if they do come in, there will be open space preserved, and not just the back 40, meaningful open space, because we've defined it and we've identified how that open space will be found on the map. So I think that, you know, from my perspective, what the Housing Task Force has incorporated in here really constitutes state-of-the-art housing zoning techniques. I was recently at a American Planning Association series of workshops on housing. And I was really pleased because everything that was recommended, this was a nationwide workshop. And we have them all in here. So I was really pleased with that. So I'm going to turn it back over to Deborah to finish up.
Thanks.
Thanks. Can I have the next slide, please? Obviously, this is a lot of material. It's overwhelming. It's, as I said a few weeks ago, you know, it's 300 pages. You don't have to read all 300 pages. As Nan said, there are parts of it that are new. It's redlined, but there are also things that have been in there. And so what we've tried to do was to come up with a set of navigation tools to help you and the boards and committees, and ultimately everyone looking at this, know where to go to learn the information about what's being discussed tonight. So we did a couple of things in the zoning and subdivision recommendations themselves. As I said here, these are weighty documents. So we did a couple of things. The first thing that I think is really important, because it is over 300 pages, is that there is an annotated table of contents. It looks like this, or that little sort of diagonal thing up there that kind of highlights all those areas that there is something new or changed for you to look at. So for instance, in subdivision, it's going to have an updated purpose statement or updated definitions. It's going to talk about the planning board procedures in the New York State law, or the cluster regulations for conservation subdivision. This is going to tell you where to go, what page. This is so that's going to accompany the document, and a similar one is done for the zoning section. There are two different sections. A lot more, I'll just show you, a lot more highlighting in the zoning section, but that was like the main area that we focused on. The other thing that Nan worked out in the task force, we came up with, how do we explain going through this voluminous document, and what is a way to guide people through a document and have it still be a legal document that can stand up. And so the tool that we used is something called Reader's Aid boxes. And they look like that sort of one-page sheet. So the top of that is an explanation of what that section's about. And then below it, in this particular instance, there's a chart that explains the different housing types. And so throughout the text, there are these boxes, and these are not part of zoning regulations. They're not intended to be. That's explicitly stated in the draft, and that would be in your final adopted law, that they are not part of the law, okay? But they're to make it easier for the reader to understand the law. And, you know, whether you've had experience with these laws or not, they are very complex. And so this is really important. And the other thing that we're giving, we have some handouts for you, is we've done a summary of the major recommended housing and zoning initiatives with the housing benefits and the environmental benefits, what each initiative is, whether it's the expansion of accessory dwelling units or conservation subdivision, what are the benefits of each. This is sort of a 2-page summary. Also, I have a longer version of this, which has all the details of each of these. And then we've also produced just a list, a summarized list, enumerated list of all the changes and things that have come through this process. So taken together, this is a packet of material. It's a lot of material, but we want to we're giving it to you as a piece so that you can then start going through it and understanding it and developing what we know are going to be many questions, and for us to have a lot more conversation in the weeks, coming weeks. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kirk, who's going to talk to you about our next steps.
Which is the last thing we're gonna do tonight with you all.
Good.
And then, yeah, I know, enough of this already, get over with it.
We're the cookies.
So we're gonna start, next slide, please. Here we go, next steps. This is 3 slides long, and then we have a couple more after that, so we'll go through them quickly. The version that we're releasing today, states on the date there, the 31st of May, is version 1. It is the recommendations that the task force is making to the town board for zoning changes to address the housing needs. So that is, and then what will follow is a request that the town board set up a questions and answers after you've had a chance to review the materials. Also, the town board will initiate internal review, which Bill read in a statement earlier this evening. And then the planning board offers comments within a designated time frame, which was Bill stated 30 days. And so then that and other boards as well, but mostly the planning board, because that's the legal side of it. And then the task force will address all the comments that are made from this version 1, all the comments that come back, and we will create a version 2. Next slide, please. That version 2 becomes no longer the task force recommendations. It becomes a local law draft for review and adoption. It gets transformed, okay, into, and that document, when it's given to the town board, it initiates a process of which Bill articulated already. And that is where the town will initiate the local law, which is again, New York State local law, for adoption of a law process. And then with that is a submission to the county. And then there's a tweaker and seeker process, public hearing process, and public comment period. That also unfolds in this second stage. And then the town ultimately reaches a point where it can make a motion to adopt the law and vote on that law. Okay, so next slide, please. One other thing that we're doing, the second and third bullet, there are repeats of what I just said, but the top bullet is what I wanted to point out, is that typically the public comment period in the second phase, we're opening that up now, beginning today, and for written, as Nan alluded to, in writing, we have the handle here, zoning updates at woodstock.ny.org. Actually, it's Bill who mentioned it in his statement. And so this is available for people to make comments after they've had a chance to review the code themselves. And we will audit, that will be an audit for us to receive that information, and we'll keep track of that information as it comes in, we meaning the task force. And so then, but basically, when we enter into the phase 2, we will then have that public comment period as well. So a lot of the same things that get addressed maybe in writing will also be brought out in public in a public hearing period. Next slide, please. So right now, what I'd like to do is just the end of it of our presentation, and the things on the right here are the documents that we are leaving with you, which is what has been articulated. The recommendations, the summary of it, the more detailed one, the highlights the proposed zoning changes in subdivision law and zoning, all these things you are all receiving this evening at the end of this, at the conclusion of this.
By email, or how's that?
Well, it's both. We have hard copy of
Okay.
this, and we are also submitting it in.
We have hard copy of a couple of.
Yeah, some of the handouts we're talking
Primarily,
about, but everything else will be coming to you digitally.
Email, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and in PDF format.
yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah, that's okay.
Right, and then of course, this PowerPoint presentation will also be made available. And so then now what I'd like to do is just simply thank the task force, for those members on the task force, that, Michael Castiglione, Jeff Collins, Richard Hepner, Judith Kerman, and Laura Reiki.
Thank you all.
And then, of course, Nan Stolzenberg is our consultant. Deborah and I are very pleased to be co-chairs of this group. It's been a pleasure to work with everyone, and we'd like to thank each and every one of you for what you've done, what you've brought. We're very excited about what we've done, and that really is the conclusion. I'd like to name one more slide, please. Next slide, please. So this is a quote that's from the comprehensive plan. It basically states that the appeal of Woodstock has survived the social and economic changes that each generation has experienced. Protecting the unique qualities of Woodstock while promoting the changes that help create a vibrant future is the task of each new generation. And that task is what we have now amongst us now with these changes that will preserve our town. And we hope that you understand the work that we've gone into, and appreciate your time this evening. Thank you.
Thank you for all your time.
Thank you for listening.
Tomorrow morning, when I get into the office, when Ashley gets into the office, we'll get all that up
Yes.
on the website. It'll be available for the public. I'll get it to the
Yeah.
board by email, or you'll distribute it to all of us. Are these the handouts?
No.
Yeah, I didn't think so. Here. We have the handouts that we'll give to each of you now, and you can take them home
Yeah.
with you.
The code though is not in the.
Not in
No,
there.
no, no.
These are just,
So, okay, so, this you really won't need until tomorrow.
thank you.
If you take one from each.
Well, we started in July last year. Every week, we've been meeting every other week.
Oh, we're there.
One.
You got one each. I got you.
You get one of those, I get one of those. and pass them along. Meetings and pass them along.
Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank
Yeah,
you
thank
so
you
much.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, yes.
Great. Bill, you have a question in the audience.
Kevin? No?
Very good.
So. Question, whether man is most qualified or anyone. How are things like septic addressed, when you increase density? Shared septic, and is there shared water, or are they still all individual systems per unit? Tiny house or clustered house, how is that?
Right. There are some in play right now.
It depends.
But there are some measures in play right now for network systems that's other organizations with people that allow network systems to exist for those types of, and we have our own town water system that will, you know. Site, every one of those sites would under strict Board of Health issues associated with the amount of water, and septic and sewer and all the things that would be isolated to that particular. All the same regulations that we follow and everything else associated with.
And it all has to go through county health.
County health. Yeah.
There also, in the last 20 years, have been a number of improved signs that are more efficient.
And so the process is to correct what can happen on that land in terms of about that. And that's where, whether it's septic or correct. Thank you.
That would be up to an engineer. So, we're gonna move on now. We've got a couple of
I
this.
would like to say my own thank you
Okay,
as
go
a
ahead.
town board member who was on this. I certainly want to thank Nan for her great job. As you see the writing, Nan has done a wonderful job writing of the document. I want to thank Nan for bringing so many wonderful ideas to the Housing Oversight Task Force. I want to thank Kirk and Deborah as the co-chairs, always came prepared because there were a lot of decisions for us to make, and Kirk and Deborah laid out, here's what we need to decide. And they communicated it well, and Nan educated us, and Kirk and Deborah in turn educated us. And certainly thank you to all of the members of the task force, because if you wonder what have we been doing for 10 months, I think you now have an idea of what we've been doing for 10 months. So I just want to say my own thank you to Nan, Kirk, Deborah for the great leadership job and everybody on the task force, because there was great balance coming in with the ideas. And even if we didn't begin by agreeing, by the time we talked and I through, everybody's points were heard and we got the best decision. So, so that's it. So thanks to all. The other thing I will say, just to double down on this version 1 that we have, it's really important in 30 days that every member of the town board and that every committee, it's available to the town board and committee members and to get the feedback in, because version 2 will be a lot less fluid. Version 1 is fluid. You heard today, not that it's going to change a lot, and I wouldn't expect it to change a lot. However, if you see things, people, as committees respond now, that's going to carry a lot of weight. Once all the committees have said, here's what we think, and we have version 2, it will have already been reviewed by so many people. So now is the time. It's very important that people jump on version 1 and that you look at it and you give your feedback back. And was said before, but I think might not have been said tonight, is each committee and board that reviews it, not the town board, we can respond as individuals, but each committee and board should respond in one response for the committee.
I'll send that out today.
Okay, because we want to make sure if the committee, like if the planning board, if 2 people disagree, well, we don't want 2 different opinions from the planning board. We want a consolidated answer back. And that will carry a lot of weight because they need documents. So,
And individuals are
welcome.
welcome to
Absolutely
respond back.
but jumping on it soon is important, because when we get version 2 out, there'll be less reason to change it because everybody will have already had a chance to look at it. So do jump on it. But that tremendous thank you to Nan, Kirk, Deborah, and the test.
Thank you, Laura. And I would just ask the board, you know, if we get through it quicker and in 2 weeks we're ready for a Q&A, you know, give me the feedback and we can make that happen sooner. So,
Yeah.
all right, thank you again,
Thank you.
guys. I've got a couple of resolutions. Be it resolved to schedule a public hearing on the proposed Xena Woods Critical Area Environmental Area, CEA, for June 21st, 2022 at 7:30 p.m. Town offices, 45 Como Drive, Woodstock, New York.
I was gonna then second that,
Okay,
'cause
so
you-
I left the part about, so we're scheduling the public hearing, that will be said, and I will continue on getting some information back, the legal notice, which we will have plenty of time next week to have that resolution. So, did you second that?
Yes,
All in favor?
Aye.
Be it resolved to adopt a complete streets policy as attached.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
So the next step with that is that I will put together a resolution. I'm going to try and have it for next week, but no later than the end of June, to make a formal complete streets committee. Yet we already have the complete streets committee that is acting as a task force, but it's, you know, it wasn't meant to be a permanent board. So we'll set that up under the guidelines that we set up all of other permanent committees.
And can we thank again the Complete Streets Committee as it
Fantastic
exists,
job.
and also the Highway Department, because Complete Streets policy came from the Complete Streets Committee, but the Highway Department combed through it to make sure it made sense, it was gonna work, and there was some collaboration, so
There
thanks to all.
there was great back and forth between you and I, then
Yes,
Complete Streets and
Well, I wanna
Scott
thank
and Heather.
yeah, thank Bill, you too, because you brought everybody together.
Thank you. Be resolved to hire Melissa Lavaglio as full-time seasonal parking lot attendant, Rock City Municipal Lot, an hourly rate of $17.24, beginning May 27th, 2022. So this, I had thought we had done this back in February, but check the minutes, and no, Melissa's been doing this for her 4th year now, but we have to hire her every year, she's seasonal. All in favor?
Aye.
Resolved that the town of Woodstock, location code 30559 hereby establishes the following, see attached page 1 only, as standard work days for elected and appointed officials, and be resolved work days to the New York State and local employment system based on the timekeeping system or record of activities maintained and submitted by these members to the clerk of this body. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Be it resolved to accept the resignation of Paul Smith as part-time typist effective June 10th, 2022.
Second.
Yes, sorry,
Was that the gentleman that's been
in my office.
in your office,
Yes.
downloading, digitizing?
You know, we hired him, this typist was the classification, but he's been doing the scanning
Right.
now for, well, I believe it could be longer. He's done a phenomenal job. He really helped us to develop a system. He's been working with Ashley these last couple of weeks, training her in what he's done. He's a minister at Overlook, and he's assignment down in Queens. So that's why we're losing him.
Will
Yeah.
we be looking for a replacement?
Yes. So I wish him the best of luck as well. All in favor?
Aye.
Resolved to forward. So before I make this resolution, has everybody had an opportunity? I think Laura sent it out today. The
Matt and I really worked on it, went out today to Maria-Elena and Reggie.
so this resolution would be to send for the library district to change the to change the LI district for the library. This would be to send it to the planning boards of the county and the town planning board. Doesn't mean we're adopting it, it starts the process for adoption.
Did you sit really? I haven't.
This is to change the line, public libraries, and allow public.
Correct. So we're creating a new, and then I think.
And it also allows it in areas that it currently exists.
Yes,
Because the line doesn't exist right now.
correct. And the other line is being, so cultural facilities, and it's being slightly altered to recognize all other libraries. For instance, you can have a private library.
Right, but not change the zoning.
We're not changing. Correct. All right, then I'll offer be it resolved for the proposed local law adding additional permitted use to the LI district, to the Woodstock, Town of Woodstock Planning Board and the Ulster County Planning Board for review.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
And I want to thank Bill. I know I worked on, I was library liaison. I worked on that. Bill forwarded me a law. I worked on it. I worked with Bennett on it. So I really appreciate the ideas that all came through that to do the right thing for the library.
Good back and forth.
Yes.
Resolved to authorize the supervisor to sign the tax, I have, before I offer this, did everybody have a chance to look at that letter? I think it only went out today.
Well, no, it went out a couple, it went
You
out
went
last week.
okay.
I sent it out last week. I resent today, but
Okay.
and I have a copy here if anybody needs to look at it.
So this is for the, we're not hiring, because it's not gonna cost us anything, but to have Clough Harbor Associates do the consulting for the NYSERDA grants for the geothermal project.
Yeah, nice, sir.
Nice, sir.
If we get the grant, that money would be Clough Harbor to do a design. It would not cost the town anything this week. And then, if we were to take the next step, that's when we might have to have.
Yeah, and can I say-
But this resolution does not get us that far.
If I could say a few words, but this has I was delegated, actually I volunteered for this item, and have been working along with Arlene on the, from the WEC. So Arlene and I have been in meetings with the Woodstock Energy Transition Group and working out, they actually brought the idea to the WEC as well as the town board and looking into this NYSERDA grant. So the idea is there is a NYSERDA grant to do an analysis of Woodstock to see where community, they call it community thermal, how could you tie properties together to get a benefit from tying properties together for community thermal? And it would be a NYSERDA grant where they would pay 100%. And so we did interview different companies who could, well, resumes were looked at, NYSERDA had a list of about 60, between CHA had looked at about 5, they interviewed about 3 of those 3, Arlene and I were on some of the interviews, and Bill was on actually one of the interviews as well. And looking at, we were very clear that the applicant should be the engineering firm, because then they are really driving it, they are doing the reporting for NYSERDA, and for them to get paid as the project is done, they're on the hook to do the reporting, and then they in turn will get the money as each phase is done. So first of all, we need to get the grant, And this is just a letter of support that the supervisor can send a letter to CHA saying, yes, we have chosen them as a result of interviews, we have chosen them we'll support them as the applicant. And again, as Bill says, it will not be a cost, phase one will not be a cost to us. But follow-on phases, there are a lot of grants, and what's great about the people we're working with is people know about places to get grants. So follow-on phases, we're hoping we get grants for those as well, but phase one would be a nice sort of grant.
Thank you, Laura. Nope. Oh, okay.
You know, we have $400,000 grant, so we'll also cover.
Right, because $100,000 will cover the engineer plus these extra things that Arlene mentions. And I have to say, it's been a pleasure to be partnering with Arlene on this because her background is DEC and she's got great background in terms of contributions to the conversation.
Okay, be it resolved to authorize the supervisor to sign the attached letter of support to proceed with Gulf Harbor Associate Consulting to prepare a category A service grant submission, assessment of areas in the town of Woodstock as candidates for community thermal.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. In a long meeting, we're gonna go home for dinner, so I'll make a motion to adjourn.
How about that would be good.
I'm not doing that tonight. It's a special
Well,
meeting,
it's a
special meeting, so.
now, are we meeting in a week and if it is a Q&A? That was the reason we're meeting, because Q&A, but are we doing Q&A?
Oh, the only thing we're meeting for next week is the public hearing for the Zoom meeting.
Oh, just move them.
Zoom meeting.
It's
The public
changing the
hearing.
law.
Ah, cool. Gotcha,
So,
very cool.
do I have a second for adjournment?
Second.
All in favor?
All right,
Thank you, folks.
big,
Yeah.
that was a big meeting.
Shorter presentation. I felt it went very
Thank you,
well.
yeah. Well, man, truly has been excellent.
Gotcha.
Next week, board matter?
Next week, we have a public hearing. Zoom meeting.
Thanks, guys.
Did you want to-
Better see
no,
you
good,
tomorrow.
thank you.
See ya.
And when is that?
What is that?
When is that?
So I'm just gonna use the restroom. I'll be right back.
Okay,